So the people that were gathered that night at Orlando Davila's home on May 3rd in 1969, they saw it all happen. First, the shouting coming from the street in front of Davila's house, then the realization that it was a man with a gun pointed right at them. And in the next moment, 2 shots fired. One of those shots hit Manuel Ramos in the head near his right eye. Another shot hit Rafael Rivera in the neck. Chaos ensued when the man with the gun, who was later identified as off-duty Chicago police officer James Lamb, was seen walking away. Lamb later testified that he fired his weapon only after he heard shots fired from across the street. When he proceeded to investigate, he reported seeing 3 men, one of whom he heard say, "Get away from there or I'll blow your head off." And another he reportedly saw reach for a weapon. Witnesses refuted Lamb's testimony, arguing instead that the police officer was the aggressor. The remaining details of that night are murky, but we know that as Manuel Ramos and Rafael Rivera were taken to the hospital, 4 of their good friends, Pedro Martinez, Jose Lin, Sal de Rivero, and Orlando Davila, all part of this group that called themselves the Young Lords Organization, were arrested, taken into custody, and tried for assaulting an officer. Manuel Ramos died later that night. James Lamb, the police officer who shot and killed him and wounded Rivera, was cleared of any wrongdoing. Manuel Ramos was a father, he was a husband, he was a brother. His death robbed his 2 children, a 2-year-old daughter and a 6-month-old baby boy at the time, of their father. Those that knew him best described him as a quiet and mild-mannered man. He served as Minister of Defense for a Young Lords organization that in 1969 was still trying to find its way, still working to see how best they could help their community, still learning the intricacies of revolutionary politics. Ramos's death, however, would serve as a turning point for the young militant group. His death brought together his fellow Young Lords from the Lincoln Park and Humboldt Park neighborhoods in Chicago, as well as members of the Black Panthers and the white Appalachian group known as the Young Patriots, at his memorial service at St. Teresa's Catholic Church. His death and the solidarity that came from black and white revolutionary groups sparked a political fire in members of the Young Lords. It was a key moment for the leader of the Young Lords, a guy by the name of Jose Chacha Jimenez, who later confessed to the journalist Frank Browning that the murder of Manuel Ramos was the point that, quote, "I became a real revolutionary." This is an artistic rendering by the artist Ricardo Morales of Manuel Ramos. Manuel Ramos's death added fuel to an already active organizing presence in Chicago neighborhoods, from Uptown to Lawndale to Lincoln Park, as multiple groups turned up the heat in the summer of 1969. Black, Latino, and white activist groups occupied institutions. They established breakfast programs for school children. They organized rallies, opened health clinics, published newspapers that promoted solidarity. Each of these movements was significant, but as I will discuss today, none more so than the takeover and the occupation of McCormick Theological Seminary. Days after Ramos's death, and as a way to protest urban renewal, members of the Lords, together with a community group known as the Poor People's Coalition, and with help from seminary students, those seminary students, walked onto the campus of McCormick Theological Seminary and occupied the newly renovated stone academic building. As soon as the activists occupied the building, they renamed it the Manuel Ramos Building as an homage to their good friend and a signal to the institutions in the neighborhood that urban renewal, or as they called it, urban removal, was not going down without a fight. This is a picture of McCormick Theological Seminary in 1969. You see the sign there and the renaming of the institution. Today, it is part of DePaul University's Music Center, this building. So my talk today focuses on the occupation of McCormick Seminary in 1969, followed by the political rise of the Young Lords organization in Chicago. From a street gang organized in 1959 to revolutionary nationalists a decade later, to their engagements with a Presbyterian bureaucracy. McCormick was a Presbyterian Seminary that they knew nothing about, all which places them in a larger conversation with Latino pastors about progressive religious politics in the 1970s. This is a part of a larger book project that I've been working on as a fellow here at the James Weldon Johnson Institute, where I examine a few and relatively unknown church building occupations that in 1969 and in 1970 fundamentally altered the reformist politics of Latina and Latino religious communities. So this is the itinerary. The book is divided into 3 sections. The first is looking at 3 distinct case studies of occupation, the first starting in Chicago. From there, looking at the Christmas Eve mass disruption by a group called Católicos por la Raza in 1969, December 24th, 1969. And then moving on to New York, which is typically the most well-known case of these church occupations, the occupation of the Spanish Methodist Church in East Harlem, or El Barrio, also in 1969, and also during that period there in Christmas. From there, the second part, looking at religious radicals, sort of following the tradition of Albert Rabato's most recent book, where he looks at American prophets and he outlines the lives and the work of 7 different religious prophets, or American prophets in the United States. I follow the work of Lidia Lopez, who was the president of the United Neighborhood Organization in Los Angeles. I met Lidia last fall. Got a chance to do an oral history interview with her to talk about her work. Her work starts at St. Basil's Church in Los Angeles the night of the Christmas Eve disruption, and then moves on. She becomes a major sanctuary movement organizer in Los Angeles in the 1980s. From there, I go to Jorge Lara Broad, who was the founding president of the Hispanic American Institute out of Austin, Texas. He worked in the United Presbyterian Church, and also was one of the chief negotiators between radical groups that occupied church buildings and seminary folks and religious communities and so forth. The last chapter, or the last section, looks at sanctuary and looks at the church as immigrant sanctuary, and wanting to sort of take a look at how and sort of conceptualize the links between the Chicana and Chicano movements and the Puerto Rican civil rights movements, and connect those to later narratives and activism around the sanctuary movement. So that, in essence, is the narrative arc of the book, moving from occupation to sanctuary in the 1980s. So I start in Chicago because it is here that the fight against urban renewal prompted the occupation of McCormick Seminary and later the Armitage Methodist Church. Those occupations kicked off a national movement of Latina and Latino radical activist groups or religious outsiders that were occupying churches and disrupting church services. And although each case and context is different, most of the occupations were part of a larger movement, again, to protest urban renewal, housing displacement, and in a few cases, the indifference of churches to the needs of their surrounding communities. On their own, each of these occupations and disruptions were dramatic instances that faded almost immediately as they rose. Each occupation lasts no more than 5 to 14 days, and the case that I cover in Los Angeles was a one-night disruption of Christmas Eve Mass. Yet in each of these cases, not only did they garner national attention by religious leaders across the country, they also helped to propel the causes of Latina and Latino Catholics and Protestants, clergy and leadership, religious insiders, whose movements for more visibility within church structures had taken root but had remained marginal until 1969 and 1970. This is one of my favorite. Hey, this is liberation theology right here on the steps of St. Basil's Catholic Church in Los Angeles, right? It's obvious he did not drive a Cadillac. The brevity and sensational theatrics of these occupations and their role in shaping Latina and Latino religious politics has until recently remained an untold story. Part of the problem is that in their immediate aftermath, evangelical news outlets like Christianity Today disregarded their importance, calling the Puerto Rican young lords, quote, gangs that trashed churches and left extensive damage, including Marxist posters and stacks of revolutionary literature that were advocating violence. These dismissals have been most notable in the historiography of the religious left, which has not only erased the participation of Latina and Latinos in the religious politics of the civil rights era, but has also produced a false narrative of passivity that ignores the contested relationships between Latina and Latino radical organizations and Protestant and Catholic leaders. Latina and Latino religious studies scholars have also turned a blind eye, preferring instead to remain tied to large-scale events such as Vatican II and the rise of liberation theology in Latin America as the most important factors in shaping Latina and Latino theology and religious politics in the United States. And before you throw tomatoes this way, both developments, I do not deny, made deep impressions on these politics. My book just takes a closer look at how these church occupations, which were rooted in neighborhood struggles, strengthened the work of Latina and Latino clergy and leadership. These were Kairos moments that tipped the scales and blew wide open the doors of the institutional church in a way that had not seen before. In essence, this is what I mean when I say that revolutionary action gave birth to Latina and Latino religion. The result was an explosion of Latina and Latino theological and ecclesiastical activity, and, as I argue, set the stage and prepared an infrastructure for the emerging sanctuary movement in the 1980s. Church occupations inspired a movement that questioned the role of churches in neighborhood politics, drew attention to interethnic and coalition politics, and blurred the lines between religious outsiders and insiders. Taken together, I want to dispute heavily, strongly, I cannot say it strongly enough, the idea that the politics of identity disrupted a supposed unified religious left in the 1970s. This is an argument that some religious scholars, not all, but some have been making as of late. And perhaps more importantly, push back against this fascination with the idea that in the 1970s, American religion took a hard right turn. So ever since I can remember, I have been fascinated with church buildings. The art and symbols that decorate their walls, the public space that engulfs them, and the spiritual meanings they carry for marginalized communities. Much of this fascination has to do with my own upbringing. I am a preacher's kid, so hopefully I don't preach too much, or try not to today, which meant that I spent a lot of time in churches as a kid. Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights, singing, praying, you know it, right? Most other days, I was there playing basketball in the hot concrete box that we call the gymnasium right behind the church building. I'll admit that my view of the church as sacred and holy space, however, did not develop until my teenage years, when in the late 1980s, our church in Brownsville, Texas, deep South Texas, became a sanctuary church, a place for refugees from Central America who were escaping war and violence in their home countries. They would stay a while, from a couple of days to sometimes 2 weeks, while they figured out the next steps in the United States. And I played basketball with many of them because I could not play soccer, although they played soccer as well. I did not understand their circumstances or their situations, but what I did grasp as a young kid was the positive impact that the church as a body of people and our church building had on the refugees and on our neighborhood. We were a small Mexican-American church, being one of the most important sanctuary churches in South Texas, poor people helping poor people. The same gym that I played basketball in became a makeshift shelter for refugees, and the sanctuary where we gathered to pray and sing became a space where people shared their transnational visions for peace and justice, where prayers were offered for the victims of violence and for the perpetrators of that violence. These experiences left a deep impression in my life that today fuels much of my interest in uncovering the history of how sacred spaces dwell in the neighborhoods that surround them and how they embody the transnational politics that have arisen as a result of globalization, immigration, and war. In doing so, I join a long list of scholars that have documented the history of resistance, from slave spirituals to global independence movements to the social gospel that emerged side by side with the labor movement here in the United States, to show how the just future that is envisioned by today's leaders of the so-called new sanctuary movement indeed has a past, it has a history. And one of the starting points of that past, I contend, starts in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. So, if you know the city of Chicago at all, this is the map. Maybe some of you have been to Navy Pier, but that's sort of the red line encircling there is the neighborhood that is called or that is known as Lincoln Park. Located in the near north side of the city, in the 1960s, Lincoln Park was a neighborhood defined both by its ethnic mix and the shared experiences of displacement. And here's a closer map. And everything really goes down, if you've ever visited or know of where DePaul University is, everything really just goes down around DePaul University. Lincoln Park became a battleground for one of the most important fights against urban renewal, with a cast of characters that ranged from Puerto Rican nationalists to welfare mothers to seminary students. More on this later, all right? So hold up. But first, picture this. Victorian brownstone homes near the lake to the east, to immigrant housing units to the west, and with plans for a shopping district with restaurants and entertainment possibilities that we know of as the Magnificent Mile, right? Lincoln Park was one of the most competitive real estate markets in the city. Add to that significant investment from the triad of institutions that really sort of hunkered down, were really sort of important institutions in the neighborhood: McCormick Seminary, DePaul University, and Children's Memorial Hospital. This was also a market where properties sold quickly, and you begin to understand why Lincoln Park was targeted in the way that it was by urban renewal hawks in the 1950s. In 1954, the Lincoln Park Conservation Association requested an urban renewal designation for the neighborhood, which included a $43 million budget, 50% matching funds from the federal government, and a four-stage, 10-year plan to really redefine and rethink what that neighborhood was all about. The urban trends in Chicago, the urban renewal trends in Chicago, were part of a larger national project that began with federal legislation that focused on the redevelopment of what investors tagged as crumbling neighborhoods in prime locations near business districts or attractive landscapes. This translated into the demolition of old buildings, raising rents to push poor people out, and making it almost impossible for poor and working people, mostly Latinos and African Americans, to stay put regardless of how long they had lived in that neighborhood. By the end of the 1960s, in a city with nearly 250,000 Latinos, urban renewal policies had normalized displacement, pushing Latinos in Chicago from neighborhood to neighborhood, often into substandard housing units where in some cases, in most cases, they paid higher rents. Forcing Puerto Ricans out of neighborhoods, pricing them out of their homes, was part of a long tradition in the city of Chicago, where, as Merida Rua put it, there existed a, quote, episodic pattern of constant movement, of loss and finding, and more loss. The experience of loss inspired a wave of Puerto Rican poets like David Hernandez, who in 1968 penned this poem about Lincoln Park and the street that he grew up on in Armitage Street. Hernandez writes, "It seems just like yesterday on Armitage Street that Alfredo and Chacha played hide and seek with Quinto the cop while Cosmo and Aidita made love in the gangway. When radios blared out open windows dressed in 5 and dime lace curtains, when staccato Spanish bounced between buildings high above the rolling traffic because telephones were insultingly impersonal. And it was no secret that eyes expressed the heart. When rice and bean smells roamed the hallways covering up the tracks of other ethnics who had since faded into the American dream, when the last summer days were spent under street rainbow fire hydrant showers, and that night you overheard your parents whisper about moving out because the rent was going up." Experiences of displacement are what made the Young Lords into the most radical and powerful Puerto Rican voice in the 1960s. Common experiences of police harassment, displacement, and poverty that brought even non-Puerto Ricans to join the Lords. People such as Omar Lopez, Mexican immigrant from San Luis Potosí, Mexico, and Kenny Smith, who described himself as a, quote, Appalachian white, joined the Young Lords organization out of a desire to fight against a system that was stacked against them. As revolutionary nationalists, they built coalitions with groups such as the Black Panther Party, the Young Patriots, Students for a Democratic Society, among others. They followed the example of the Black Panther Party and set up breakfast programs for kids daycare center, free healthcare clinics. They brought students, medical students from Northwestern University to head up those clinics, and a legal aid office. These radical movements were only one part of the wide range of community activism that emerged in Chicago during this time. And yet an often overlooked element are the faith-based social movements that also emerged out of Catholic and Protestant churches throughout the city of Chicago. Grounded in the early 20th century formulations of the social gospel, these movements blended faith and direct political action as a means to bring about social change. The eclectic mix of social gospel and evangelicalism that characterized Chicago made it one of liberal Protestantism's most important cities during the first half of the 20th century. But by the late 1960s, religious groups such as the Northside Cooperative Ministry in Lincoln Park were more direct in their activism as they forged a relationship with groups like the Young Lords and others in the area as they pushed against and organized against urban renewal. The Chicago Daily News called it the clergy and radical link-up. It was central because it was through this association that the idea first emerged to occupy McCormick Seminary as a way to call out the hypocrisy of a Christian institution that in 1969 supported urban renewal and by association, the continued displacement of Puerto Ricans and other poor people in that neighborhood. But why occupy a seminary? Because not only was McCormick the weakest of that triad of DePaul and the hospital in that neighborhood, but the Lords believed that they could exploit the seminary's hypocrisy. So everything starts on May 6, 1969 with an invitation. And I loved it. And by the way, a lot of the flyers that in the Young Lords organization documents and the archives in different places across the country are bilingual. So there would have been an English sign and there would have been a Spanish one as well, para la comunidad. And also one of my favorite things about doing this research is to find posters like this that say, if you come out and support us, there will be music, there will be dancing, there will be food. That's it right there, people. That's what gives me hope. So everything starts on May 6 in 1969 when a coalition of close to 1,000 people that included the Northside Cooperative Ministry, the Young Lords, and seminary students rallied to protest the dedication of the newly built stone academic building. Black, Puerto Rican, and white community leaders joined McCormick students and faculty to voice their frustration over the $2 million price tag for that new building and to present seminary leaders with a set of demands. In dramatic fashion, seminary students set up a tent village, and I'm trying to find, together with Jonathan's help, I'm trying to find originals of there are photographs of the seminary students setting up these tent villages across campus. So I didn't want to put a grainy photograph up here for you, but there are photos of that tent village where up to 29 students and their families camped out as a symbolic act of solidarity with the mostly black and Puerto Ricans who were being forced out of Lincoln Park. The next day, the seminary's newsletter described the scene at the stone building as such. Quote, a Wheaton insurance man and a North suburban pastor brushed shoulders, as it were, with a young militant Puerto Rican leader and welfare mothers. Another observer noted the children running around playing with their parents, some walking around with industrial workers of the world flags, who shuffled back and forth between watching their kids and condemning seminary leaders. This occupation was a family affair. The very next day, on May 7th, as McCormick's administration met with its board of trustees, a coalition of students and community leaders presented them with a set of demands. $601,000 for low-income housing in Lincoln Park, facilities for a daycare center, tear down that iron fence around McCormick Seminary, space for a Puerto Rican cultural center, $25,000 for the Young Lords to develop cultural programs, $25,000 for a legal aid office that was led by the Latin American Defense Organization, or LADO. The seminary must also publicly condemn the governmental attacks and FBI surveillance of the Black Panthers, Young Lords, and the Latin American Defense Organization, or LADO. Now, I won't get into it, but each demand was very carefully crafted, right? Even that number, 601,000. Each demand was carefully crafted with the help of McCormick students and with the close guidance of Obed Lopez, the leader of LADO, or the Latin American Defense Organization, and his brother Omar Lopez. But in the end, none of that mattered. The board rejected every demand, and that prompted moving from just a protest outside of the Stone Academic Building into a full occupation of the seminary. The groups who have seized the building, the local socialist press reported, are black, Latin, and white. Little red books are in evidence, and the clenched fist is the accepted greeting as you walk under the seminary. That's the case here at Candler, right? I think so. Anyway. And this is a much closer shot. This, by the way, this young man right here is Jose Chacha Jimenez, who I got to meet while doing archival research at Grand Valley State University in Michigan, where there's a collection of the young lord's documents. I was in the archive, and the archivist there said, by the way, Chacha is in the student center having lunch, so if you want to go say hi, you can go meet him. So we met, had a good time, started interviewing him, and I've created a relationship with him since. The occupation of the Stone Building capped off a prosperous and turbulent decade for McCormick Seminary. In the 1960s, McCormick enjoyed financial prosperity that allowed them to hire new faculty, raise $10 million for campus development, and begin construction on a new $1.2 million student dormitory. Economic prosperity, however, masked larger institutional problems. In the 1960s, students demanded that the seminary hire black faculty and staff and provide courses in black history and culture, and that it break its tight relationship with the, quote, oh so white Lincoln Park Conservation Association. And McCormick's problems were not unique, right? Theological schools across the country faced strong challenges from their students in the midst of a changing political and theological atmosphere in the 1960s. This was, as one scholar put it, the era of, quote, theological confusion. For seminaries, churches, and mainline Protestant denominations that shook their very foundations. And even as seminaries and churches celebrated record financial surpluses, that spurred on new construction, soaring enrollment, and new programming in the post-war era. They froze in the face of the moral questions raised by black and Latino freedom activists. Now, the entire occupation of McCormick Seminary lasts 5 days, and there are a variety of reports of what went on inside the building, the negotiations between the lords and the seminary administration, and so on. All of which are fine, all of which you all can read when you buy the book and when this book is out, and I hope you do, right? But for the purposes of my talk today, I want to go straight to where the story takes an unexpected turn and why the occupation ended so abruptly after 5 days. As it turns out, just as the Lords occupied the seminary building, the United Presbyterian Church, USA, was beginning its 181st General Assembly in San Antonio, Texas. When the Lords stepped foot on the campus to occupy the seminary, Obed Lopez, the leader of the Latin American Defense Organization, boarded a bus for San Antonio. Lopez not only worked his way onto the agenda of the Presbyterian Assembly, but he also had the opportunity to meet James Forman, Gayrod Wilmore, who was the leader of the Office on Church and Race for the United Presbyterian Church at the time, and Eleazar Risco, the editor of La Raza newspaper out of Los Angeles. And here's a picture of all those fine gentlemen. I'm trying to find an original of this one, but starting from this end here, this is Obed Lopez from Chicago. He's next is Eleazar Risco. Right there in the middle is James Forman. Gayrod Wilmore is sitting right next to him. Now, however much Latino clergy that were there, part of the Presbyterian Church, hoped to make a splash, there was no doubt that the star of the show was James Forman. The former SNCC leader had put white church leaders on high alert with his bold demands in the Black Manifesto, which demanded churches to pay $500 million in reparations in 1969. And church disruptions in places like Detroit and New York. As a matter of fact, a group that was working with Forman was occupying the church offices of the Presbyterian Church in New York City right during this particular assembly. As Forman addressed the Presbyterian Assembly, it was clear that his charisma had captured the day. Those who heard him speak described his talk as, quote, witty, knowledgeable, and scathing. If the presence of Forman at the General Assembly, quote, felt like a storm breaking around the heads of the church, the Latino contingent seemed to pale in comparison. They were quiet, they were unassuming, and nobody knew who they were. Few in the audience that day felt threatened by any of the Latino clergy, and much less by Obed Lopez as an outsider. For white Presbyterians, Latino demands simply lacked the historical weight and urgency of Forman's manifesto. Latinos were a people without a history at this assembly, a people who in the 1960s were considered by many to be the, quote, invisible minority. So when it came time for Obed Lopez to address the assembly, he carried a heavy burden. And you can hear it in his voice, and we know this because the Presbyterian Church in their archives in Philadelphia has a recording of the moment when Forman, Obed Lopez, and others are presenting their demands, those demands that you saw in an earlier slide, presenting those demands to the Presbyterian Assembly. Lopez, when it came time to address the assembly, he carried that heavy burden. Not only did he have to compete with the charisma and power of Forman's demands, he had to do so in a way that filled the huge gap that most in the delicate body had about Latina and Latino history, activism, and politics. And although Lopez might not have upstaged Forman's fiery and charismatic style on that day, he did enough to compel the assembly to take his demands seriously. This meant two things primarily: that they would begin working with the Chicago Presbytery and the offices of the National Board of Missions to negotiate with the Young Lords. Part of that negotiation including funding a low-income housing proposal for Lincoln Park to counter the plans that were being put forth by the city, among other things. As a result, 5 days into the occupation, Lopez assures his comrades in Chicago that it was time to end the occupation on May 18, 1969. Now, the following months after the occupation, a lot happens. During this so-called Rainbow Summer of 1969, McCormick Seminary, with the help of the Chicago Presbytery and the National Board of Missions, started delivering on the demands that Obed Lopez had made to that assembly. First came a $3,000 check to hire Howard Allen and Associates to develop a competitive bid for low-income housing in Lincoln Park. But even so, Lopez and the Lords remained frustrated with the pace of church leaders who stalled or completely rejected the 8 demands outlined at the assembly. As a result, the next month, in June of 1969, they moved to occupy the Armitage Methodist Church and started to hold important community activities in that church. And as soon as they occupied it, they renamed it the People's Church, La Iglesia de la Gente o La Iglesia del Pueblo. But by late fall of 1969, just as a new low-income housing proposal was being drafted and being prepared to be submitted to the city of Chicago, Latino Presbyterian clergy organized as a group that was called the Presbyterian Latin American Caucus, entered the picture dead set on blocking any collaboration, financial or otherwise, between Presbyterian institutions and these quote-unquote outsiders. In the midst of building a movement, in the midst of responding to the social needs of the people of Lincoln Park, and just as their proposal for low-income housing had begun to take shape, Latino Presbyterians became another roadblock. Latino clergy claimed that in the last few years, they had also drafted proposals for daycare centers, for free healthcare clinics, and social services, only to be rejected every single time by the white Presbyterian leadership. But now, they said, the demands of these radical outsiders had opened the denomination's treasure chest in a way it had never for these religious insiders. The Reverend Jose Burgos argued that, quote, these proposals are another example of the Presbytery funding outsiders, not insiders. That is, faithful Presbyterian pastors. There are higher priorities in mission development for Latin communities than the funding of these organizations. Another pastor noted, quote, the kids from the Young Lords organization are scaring a lot of naive, guilty gringo suckers around who don't know the score. And the hits kept coming. The Lords were dismissed as, quote, hippies who do not represent the Puerto Rican and Mexican American communities. Their frustrations were aimed at the Lords was coming from a cadre of Latino Protestant clergy who felt they had been upstaged by a group of religious outsiders, and in many ways they had. By the spring of 1970, the pushback coming from Latino Presbyterians still was not enough to drown out the enthusiasm for a low-income housing proposal, which promised to be a serious bid among two other competitive bids being put forth by the city of Chicago to transform Lincoln Park. The proposal from Howard Allen and Associates called for a 36-unit apartment complex with plans to expand to 70 that included ramps to make the laundry area accessible to all residents and community streets for people to host parties and to hang out in the evenings. And 40% of those units under this plan would be available for low-income residents, far surpassing the 15% minimum that was mandated by the federal government. And the best picture that I have for this proposal is this one right here. And this is where it becomes really interesting too, because this is a movement that starts off as an occupation, a group that obviously did not have any funding, chooses to occupy this seminary. They get lucky with the assembly happening right at that moment, and they're able to gain some financial support from the United Presbyterian Church to move forward on a particular bid for what low-income housing might look like there in Lincoln Park. And this was no shoddy job. The Chicago Sun-Times called the proposal imaginative and urged the city to seriously consider, quote, the new concepts being proposed by this indigenous group of Chicagoans. They are the voice of the people in the neighborhood, and they are entitled to be heard. Support also came from a coalition of professional architects across the city that called the proposal, quote, exciting as architecture, whatever that means, and pleaded with the city to approve it. Of course, resistance to the proposal emerged from the usual suspects. One Lincoln Park resident found the proposal to be, quote, sociologically and architecturally appalling. And another resident said, I ask you not to turn this area into another low-income slum. And these comments aside, in the end, even the conservative and pro-urban renewal group in Lincoln Park, the Community Conservation Council of Lincoln Park, that was appointed by Mayor Daley, by the way, appointed by Mayor Daley himself, overwhelmingly supported that proposal with an 11-2 vote. Out of the three proposals that were put forth to the city of Chicago and that were being considered, the coalition's proposal received full community support from people on both sides of that debate. And this should have sealed the deal for Lincoln Park's future, but instead it only fired up city leaders, outsiders to the neighborhood, who at the end of the day ignored the community's choice, something it had never done in other neighborhoods. It had always listened to the voice of the wealthy and the powerful within that particular neighborhood. And instead it selected the Hartford Construction Company, whose proposal fit better with the city's development plans and whose low-income housing designation barely met the federal minimum of 15%. As you can imagine, this was a crushing loss. You could not have scripted a better plan of action. They occupied and demanded funding from McCormick Seminary. They hired an architect. They got the Chicago Housing Authority to ensure that they could secure 40% of the units for low-income families. And in what perhaps was their greatest victory, their proposal won the support even from their enemies, the pro-urban renewal group in Lincoln Park. As more than 300 members of the Poor People's Coalition crowded into City Hall, the news that the Department of Urban Renewal had rejected their bid brought out an auditory gasp in the community. The Lords and Lincoln Park in general would never recover, really never be the same again. And it comes through in the oral histories that I do when I talk in the conversations that we have still about what happened in Lincoln Park. And perhaps it is this loss, the fact that a valiant push to put the brakes on urban renewal in Chicago failed, that has kept the Young Lords from their place among some of the most important civil rights groups of their generation. When the decision came down in the spring of 1970, it had been more than a year of nonstop organizing, coupled with stints in jail of several of the Young Lords, nonstop twists and turns in a story that is one of the most important in the fights against urban renewal. Frustrated, angry, and flat out exhausted, the sense of loss would prove to be the most difficult hurdle for this group to overcome. As bad as this loss was, and if you know anything about what Lincoln Park looks like today, then you know No one could have predicted that in the years after the occupation, McCormick Seminary would institute Latino and Black theological studies. In 1973, they hosted a consultation on Latino strategies for the 1970s in the Midwest that attracted over 300 Latina and Latino clergy, community activists, and politicians from across the Midwest. This was, as they called it, un diálogo entre la iglesia y el barrio, a conversation between the church and the neighborhood, to discuss issues such as racism, mental health, community control, and education. The following year, McCormick Seminary took an historic step when it joined several seminaries across the United States in launching their own Latino Theological Studies program. So I end where I began, with Manuel Ramos. The loss of a dear friend and a comrade in the struggle, a husband and the father of 2 babies, changed the course of his family's history and that of the Young Lords. In the days after the low-income housing proposal from the coalition was rejected by the city, activists continued to pay a heavy price. On March 23, 1970, the Latin American Defense Organization offices were ransacked and burned to the ground. Their files, furniture, all that Obed Lopez had worked to build was lost forever. And as quickly as their light shot up, the Lords also started their own steady decline in the spring of 1970. Members of the Young Lords organization spent time in and out of jail, remained under strict FBI surveillance, and they feared for their own lives as they witnessed the loss of people close to them. Manuel Ramos in 1969, the Reverend Bruce and Eugenia Johnson, the pastors of that Armitage Methodist Church, who were killed in September of 1969. Their murder, they were the pastoral couple that let the Young Lords into the building, allowed them to do their work and to establish daycare centers and a clinic. They were stabbed to death in their home as their children watched. That case has never been solved. No one has ever been brought to justice in the murders of the Reverend Bruce and Eugenia Johnson. And almost 7 months to the day when Manuel Ramos was killed in Chicago, Fred Hampton, the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, was also killed in December of 1969. In Chicago, the Young Lords worked at a dizzying pace to reduce gang violence, to make sure kids did not go to school hungry, and they had the support of the community. You can't do it without the local grocers willing to supply the food to make the breakfast for those kids, to provide access to free health care, and to participate in a collaborative project to build a people's park in the neighborhood. They were pragmatists that provided social services even as they linked their struggles against colonialism with that of activists in Latin America and the Third World. They staged their struggle out of their own sense of loss, out of their struggles, as they sought to make visible what had once been invisible, and to show the vibrancy of Latina and Latino communities, even as they highlighted the experiences of police brutality, segregation, and poverty. They were our muckraker journalists, our public historians, documenting the ills of society in newspaper articles, showing up to city council meetings by claiming their place in the neighborhood and by building trust with families in the community. What they are not often remembered for, but what I hope my work adds to their litany of accomplishments and work and struggle, is their role in planting the seeds for the rise of a Latina and Latino religious politics. Few white church leaders knew anything at all about this invisible minority, whose words sounded like, as one Presbyterian church leader said, far-off thunder. By the end of 1969, what had started in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood had now spread across the country as Mexican-American and Puerto Rican activists laid claim to a colonial institution whose own foundations were cracking under the weight of rapid change in the 1960s. In Los Angeles, there are rumblings among Chicana and Chicano activists that are saying, let's do what the Lords did at that church over there. As I demonstrate in the book, activists in each of these cities used the McCormick case to stage their own church disruptions and occupations. And more importantly, as I map out the intricacies of the relationship between outsiders and insiders, religious reformers and radicals, what emerges is a Latina and Latino religious politics that is rooted in the concerns for justice and in a vision of home, of place, where the right to stay, the right to live freely, the right to gather for the common good, and the right to reconfigure space came together as the Lord's very literally made the People's Church a sanctuary. Thank you very much.